Blood is thicker than water, they say, but blood can also turn into slow poison. Family isn't defined by shared DNA. It is defined by the person standing beside you when the storm hits and the world falls apart around you. The heavy iron gates of the Pinecrest facility swung open with a dull, grating sound that cold morning. I am Helen Vance, 68 years old, and as I stepped out of the transport van into the gravel driveway of this isolated facility tucked deep into rural Massachusetts, I knew with absolute certainty that I was walking straight into a calculated trap constructed by my own flesh and blood. There were no shouting matches or dramatic public scenes when I arrived. The whole grim operation was carried out with cold, clinical efficiency. 2 facility staff members took my elbows, guiding me toward the front entrance as if I were a stranger. They carried my single suitcase, the very bag I had carefully packed the night before, thinking I was heading to a quiet family Sunday dinner at Daniel's newly purchased estate. Instead of a warm dining table, what waited for me in the private study was an intimidating stack of legal folders and a medical consultant who had clearly been paid to look the other way. My son, Daniel, the boy I raised entirely on my own after a heavy steel beam collapsed on his father at a downtown construction site when Daniel was just 5 years old, had spent months setting up an airtight legal maneuver. Through a series of fabricated medical reports and a physician willing to sign off on false cognitive assessments, Daniel and his wife, Jessica, had petitioned the local probate court completely behind my back. They declared me legally incapacitated, claiming I was suffering from rapid, late-stage cognitive decline and could no longer manage my own life, my decisions, or my assets. I looked at Daniel one last time through the glass doors. Daniel avoided my eyes completely, turning away without offering a single word, gesture, or glance of remorse. That utter silence hurt far deeper than being physically forced into this facility. Standing right there in that cold lobby, a dark, suffocating wave of self-doubt washed over my chest. Did I miss something all those years? Was this ruthless ambition always hidden deep inside him? Or did I somehow create it by working too hard and giving him everything he ever asked for without ever teaching him the true cost of survival? The facility director slid the final conservatorship papers across the reception desk for me to acknowledge. I didn't even need my reading glasses to recognize the signature at the bottom of the last page. It was Daniel's handwriting, neat, deliberate, and completely devoid of any hesitation or moral friction. With that single legal stroke, my 38-year-old son stripped away my legal independence and seized full operational control over everything I owned, rewriting my entire future on a single piece of fraudulent paper. Millions of dollars representing my entire life's work. That was the staggering financial reality, compiled meticulously over 4 decades as a professional structural engineer alongside my corporate pension and suburban home equity. Every single dollar saved through countless double shifts and sacrificed vacations after my beloved husband's tragic death had been transferred overnight into an account controlled entirely by Daniel and Jessica to bail out their reckless high society debts, cover their luxury cars, and maintain their failing corporate lifestyle in Boston. The official court paperwork claimed the funds were necessary to cover my specialized residential care fees at Pinecrest. The underlying truth was far more straightforward. They needed my entire capital to sustain their superficial standing in high society and secure their social circles. The staff motioned for me to move down the long corridor. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, the mechanical lock sliding into place with a sharp, heavy echo. The air inside Pinecrest smelled heavily of industrial bleach and stagnant indoor heat, thick with an absolute crushing silence, broken only by the low, distant hum of fluorescent lights, making every breath feel heavy and restricted. They believed they had locked away a helpless, broken woman who would suppress her voice and spend her days staring blankly at the walls. They had completely misjudged their target. An engineer doesn't give up when a foundation fails. An engineer inspects the damage, finds the structural faults, and prepares for what comes next, because a damaged foundation can always be rebuilt from the ground up. The iron gates of Pinecrest were far behind me, but the true roots of this betrayal stretched back 33 years. To understand how my only son could legally lock me away in a concrete facility, you have to look closely at what it actually took to build the man he became. When Daniel was only 5 years old, a heavy steel beam collapsed on a downtown construction site, crushing his father beneath it in an instant. From that single Tuesday morning on, it was just the two of us against a harsh world. I became both mother and father to him, shouldering every burden without a single word of complaint. I took off my hard hat, only to sit at the kitchen table late into the night, studying blueprints under a dim lamp to earn extra engineering credentials. Every promotion I fought for, every dollar I saved as a chief structural engineer, went straight into Daniel. I put him through elite private schools, drove him to endless soccer practices, and paid every dollar of his tuition at Harvard Business School. I genuinely believed I was crafting an honorable man. Over the years, a few former colleagues occasionally invited me to invest in engineering and real estate ventures they were starting. Most of those investments quietly grew in the background, but I never talked about them at home. To Daniel, I was simply his hardworking mother, and I never felt the need to tell him otherwise. For a long time, he truly was. Years ago, Daniel was happily married to a wonderful young woman named Sarah. They lived a peaceful life in a modest suburban home and had a sweet little boy, my beloved grandson Leo, who filled our family gatherings with genuine laughter far away from the noisy world of high society. Then, everything shattered the night Daniel attended an upscale corporate gala in downtown Boston and met Jessica. Jessica came from an old Boston family whose financial fortune had evaporated generations ago, leaving behind only social ambitions and a desperate need for status. Once she set her eyes on Daniel, the shift was a slow, agonizing poison that quietly crept into our lives. The first real crack happened on my 62nd birthday. I spent the afternoon cooking his favorite roast beef dinner and sat at the dining table until 2 a.m, watching the food grow cold while the clock ticked in the silence. He never came. At dawn, a short text popped up on my phone. "Sorry, Mom, investors came first tonight." I stared at the screen, swallowed the lump in my throat, and lied to myself that it was just one busy night, just one minor sacrifice for his career. But the neglect soon spread to his own home. A month later, little Leo stood by the front window for hours in his soccer uniform, clutching his ball, waiting for his father to take him to his championship game. Daniel had promised him all week that he would be in the front row. Instead, Jessica dragged him to an exclusive rooftop party in the city to meet high-profile developers. Sarah had to kneel down on the hallway floor, wipe away Leo's tears, and gently lie to our boy that his father was stuck saving the world at work. Daniel was changing from the inside out, systematically convinced that his working-class roots, his structural engineer mother, and his grounded wife were heavy anchors holding him back from the elite circles he craved. When I discovered his infidelity, I confronted him right in my living room, warning him that he was throwing away his moral compass for a hollow illusion. But blinded by ambition, Daniel chose betrayal. He announced he was divorcing Sarah. the woman who had stood by him through his broke years, to marry Jessica and secure his new social standing. They ruthlessly cast Sarah and 8-year-old Leo out with virtually nothing. I will never forget the night Daniel coldly pushed the divorce papers across my kitchen table, while Jessica stood by the doorway, watching with folded arms. Sarah held little Leo close against her chest, signed the pages without saying a single word, and walked out into the freezing rain. I couldn't fight them openly through the courts back then, because custody and property laws were heavily tangled, but I fought quietly in the shadows. Behind their backs, I opened a separate, anonymous bank account. Every single month, I funneled a portion of my personal savings to Sarah, paying the rent on her small apartment, buying groceries, and making sure my grandson Leo had clothes on his back and shoes that fit his growing feet. Sarah was the only person in that fractured family who loved me for my heart, not my wallet. Standing in my sterile room at Pinecrest, looking out at the iron fence, I realized that the son I spent my entire life building had finally become the architect of his own destruction. 18 months inside that isolated facility taught me what it truly felt like to be erased. To the world outside, I was simply Helen Vance, a deteriorating old woman suffering from severe cognitive decline. That was the official narrative Daniel and Jessica constructed. Every phone call I attempted to make was intercepted, every letter I tried to write vanished, and my personal smartphone was confiscated on day one under the guise of medical protocol. To keep me compliant, the facility staff routinely slipped morning and evening sedatives into my water pitcher, turning me into a sluggish shadow on paper so that any casual visitor would immediately believe the fake medical files. Yet, beneath that drugged exterior, I quietly poured the laced water into the roots of a potted plant when no one was looking. My mind remained clear, but surviving in that room wasn't easy. There were long, terrifying nights when the ice-cold reality of my situation hit me in the dark. Staring at the white ceiling, my heart would race with a paralyzing fear. What if I die in my sleep before anyone finds out? What if my body gives out in this room and Daniel wins forever? Late one night, through the thin plaster walls, I listened to an elderly woman in the next room softly weeping, calling out her daughter's name for hours. No one came. No orderly walked in to check on her. I pulled the rough, thin blanket over my chest, staring into the dark, struck by a cold realization that made my throat tighten. If I give up now, maybe tomorrow no one will remember my name either. Even after Chloe slipped me the phone, fear kept me paralyzed. I held that cold piece of plastic under my blanket, my thumb hovering over the keypad, utterly terrified to press dial. My palms were sweating. I knew if an orderly walked in, or if a line trace caught the signal, this single lifeline would be confiscated forever. I would lose my only window to the outside world, and Daniel would lock me away in an even darker place. That sharp, raw dread was always lingering, threatening to swallow me whole. But instead of letting panic break me, I forced myself to focus on the small details. I mapped out the daily rhythms of the facility, memorizing shift changes and security blind spots. And I wasn't the only one paying attention. A young nursing assistant named Chloe had been watching me for weeks. She noticed that unlike the other patients, I never forgot a nurse's name. She saw how I tracked the wall clock, how my eyes stayed sharp, and how I carefully feigned sleep whenever the head doctor walked in. She knew I wasn't sick. One night, during a quiet shift change, Chloe slipped into my room. Her own grandmother had once been taken advantage of by greedy relatives, and seeing me trapped there was too much for her conscience. Without a word, she slid a tiny black market burner phone beneath my mattress. That small phone became my lifeline, but my first attempts to use it were a reality check. I tried calling the local police, only for the officer to check my file, see Daniel's legal guardianship documents, and politely tell me to take my medication. I called an old neighbor, but Daniel had already visited her months ago, sighing about my sad, paranoid delusions. She gently hung up on me. No one wanted to get involved. Exhausted and running out of options, I dialed a number I hadn't used in decades. Marcus Vance, a fierce civil rights and litigation attorney I worked with years ago, who specialized in dismantling fraudulent conservatorships. Marcus didn't take my word blindly. He immediately dispatched a private investigator to dig quietly into Daniel and Jessica's financial footprint in Boston. What that investigation uncovered made my blood run colder than the winter wind lashing against my window. When Marcus called me back on that hidden phone late one night, whispering through a wall of static, the absolute truth spilled out. My son hadn't merely stolen my $2,400,000 to pad a comfortable nest egg. Daniel was drowning in a catastrophic financial sinkhole. To purchase that $1 million waterfront mansion in the exclusive suburbs of Boston, the glittering estate Jessica demanded to cement their permanent place in high society, their regular bank accounts and mortgages had fallen desperately short. Jessica's appetite for luxury was endless, and Daniel had foolishly turned to unregistered predatory shadow lenders and underground credit rings. He had forged my signature to use my properties as collateral, accumulating a staggering mountain of illegal debt that was on the verge of collapsing on top of them. They hadn't just committed elder theft to live comfortably. They were sitting on a ticking time bomb. To keep dangerous loan sharks off their necks, they needed me completely erased so they could liquidate every remaining cent I owned before their creditors finally hunted them down. Listening to Marcus spell out those debt numbers in the dark silence of my room, the fear that had plagued me for months finally transformed into something rock solid. They thought they had buried me alive in a concrete box to rot in silence, but my son's house of cards was built on stolen ground, and I was about to pull the foundation right out from under him. 18 months of confinement ended, not with a noisy public explosion, but with a quiet knock on the facility administrator's office door. My attorney, Marcus, walked into that sterile building, accompanied by 2 independent medical specialists and a court bailiff carrying an official decree. They brought psychiatric evaluations, proving my mind was completely intact. The corrupted doctors Daniel had paid off had zero legal ground left to stand on, and under the weight of the court's intervention, they were forced to sign my immediate release papers. I was finally free. But as I walked out through those heavy glass doors and took my first breath of fresh outside air, reality hit us hard. Marcus turned to me with a grim expression as we stood in the parking lot. The facility's head physician, the man who signed my fake dementia diagnosis, had suddenly vanished overnight, and Daniel's lawyers had quietly altered the initial intake records to make it look like I had entered voluntarily. Without that doctor's testimony, a criminal lawsuit could take years, Marcus warned, shaking his head, and we don't have years. Then came the second blow. My private investigator called with urgent news. Daniel had just listed my beloved suburban home on the market for an emergency cash sale. He was days away from liquidating the last piece of my life to pay off his immediate debts and cover his tracks. My blood ran cold. The legal system was moving too slow, and my son was about to walk away completely untouched, sitting high in his luxury mansion while my life was erased. If the law couldn't punish him fast enough, I would use the one thing Daniel cared about most: his ruthless, unquenchable ambition. There was one part of my professional life I had never shared with Daniel. He knew I had invested over the years, but he never knew how far those investments had grown, or who I had built them with. Throughout my long career as a chief structural engineer, I hadn't just built skyscrapers, I had quietly invested in them. Decades ago, I co-founded a private venture capital firm operating in the Boston financial market called Aegis Capital. To my son and his grasping wife, I was merely a retired widow, living off a modest pension check. They had no idea that the old mother they tried to bury alive actually held the purse strings of the very corporate market Daniel was trying so desperately to conquer. At that exact moment, Daniel's real estate firm was rapidly bleeding cash. His bad investments were catching up to him, predatory lenders were threatening his family, and his high society lifestyle was crumbling. He was desperately hunting for a massive lifeline to save his reputation and keep Jessica satisfied. He was a drowning man, grabbing at anything floating within reach. We gave him exactly what he was looking for. Through an anonymous corporate intermediary, Aegis Capital offered Daniel a $15 million emergency bailout package. To him, it looked like an absolute miracle. A massive flood of cash designed specifically to save failing luxury developers. Blinded by arrogance and desperate to keep up appearances for Jessica's elite circle, Daniel didn't ask basic questions. He didn't look closely at who was backing the firm, nor did he bother to read the fine print. His pure, unadulterated greed made him reach for the pen without a single second thought. Without hesitation, Daniel signed every single page, completely convinced he had saved his career and cemented his status at the very top of Boston society. He had no idea that the ink on that paper gave Aegis Capital absolute legal authority to seize every asset he owned the moment his reckless spending caught up with him. Sitting in my new office, holding a hot cup of coffee as I looked at the scanned copy of Daniel's signed contract on my screen, the heavy tension of the last 18 months finally evaporated. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game against an old, broken woman. He didn't realize he had just stepped straight into my trap, and I was holding the switch. Outside the Beacon Hotel in downtown Boston, I sat in the back of a black limousine, staring through the tinted glass at the financial elite gliding up the red carpet. My hands were visibly shaking in my lap. Marcus glanced over at me, his hand resting on the door handle. "Ready?" I looked at the glittering entrance, took a slow, heavy breath, and said quietly, "No." Then I pulled myself up, squared my shoulders, and stepped out into the cold night air. Inside, the grand ballroom was packed for the annual real estate gala. Tonight belonged entirely to my son and his ambitious wife. Daniel stood at the center of the stage in a tailored tuxedo, an arm wrapped tightly around Jessica. Holding up a glass of champagne, he took the microphone and triumphantly announced to the room of bankers and socialites that his firm had just secured a massive multi-million-dollar investment package for his dream development project. The applause was deafening. Cameras flashed, capturing Daniel's wide, arrogant smile. Standing near the back, I watched him laugh. And for a split second, my mind flashed back 23 years. I saw a 10-year-old Daniel, covered in mud, laughing with pure joy when I bought him his very first bicycle after working 3 straight weekend shifts. My chest tightened with a sharp, familiar ache. But as he raised his glass to the crowd, the illusion faded. I stared at the cold, greedy stranger on that stage and made peace with reality. That little boy no longer exists. I paused right outside the heavy double doors of the ballroom, listening to the muffled cheers echoing inside. My heart hammered against my ribs, and for a fleeting second, every instinct told me to turn around and walk away. Marcus leaned in, whispering softly, "One last chance, Helen. We can still walk away." I turned to look at Sarah standing beside me. She didn't say a word. She simply gave me a firm, silent nod of absolute reassurance. I took a deep breath, place my hands on the brass handles, and push the doors open. The room went dead silent. Every single head turned. I walked smoothly through those doors, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. I wasn't wearing the drab clothes of a memory care patient anymore. I wore a tailored midnight blue velvet suit, my silver hair styled with sharp precision, and a diamond brooch pinned to my lapel, a family heirloom Daniel thought he had sold off months ago. On my right walked Marcus, looking as cold as granite. On my left was Sarah, stepping forward in a sleek black business suit, radiating absolute confidence. Sarah wasn't the weeping woman Daniel had thrown out into the cold. She was now standing beside me as the newly appointed chief financial officer of Aegis Capital. We moved slowly, the crowd instinctively parting ways, as we walked straight down the central aisle toward the stage where Daniel and Jessica stood frozen. The moment Daniel's eyes locked onto mine, every drop of color drained from his face. The triumphant smile vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated horror, as if he were staring straight at a ghost. His fingers went numb. The crystal champagne glass slipped straight from his hand, crashing hard onto the floor and shattering into 1,000 pieces. The sharp ring of breaking glass echoed through the dead silence. Jessica gasped, clutching frantically at Daniel's arm, her eyes darting in panic between me and Sarah. Daniel's lips parted, but no sound came out. His chest heaved in shallow, desperate breaths. The frail, senile old woman he had locked away in a facility to steal her life savings was standing right here in the center of Boston's most elite room. But I wasn't a victim anymore. I stopped at the foot of the stage, tilted my head, and met my son's terrified gaze directly. I didn't smile, and I didn't raise my voice. I simply let him look at the mother he had tried to erase, knowing that the entire city was watching his downfall begin. Before anyone in that paralyzed ballroom could catch their breath, Marcus Vance stepped forward. He walked with the calm authority of a man holding all the cards, climbing the wooden steps onto the elevated stage. Daniel stood frozen. Marcus didn't bother looking at him. Instead, he pulled a certified legal decree from his briefcase and tapped the microphone. The sharp screech of feedback cut through the room. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." Marcus's voice echoed smoothly across the hall. "I am Marcus Vance, representing Aegis Capital. Tonight, we are executing an immediate foreclosure and asset seizure against this firm." Daniel staggered backward, his face pale as paper. "What are you talking about? There's no default. We pay the quarterly interest. I'm calling my legal team right now." Desperate to maintain control, Daniel spun toward the crowd of high society guests, raising his hands with a strained, sweating smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, this is a massive misunderstanding. An illegal, hostile takeover by a shadow firm. Don't listen to this." A few wealthy investors in the front row began nodding, murmuring among themselves in agreement. For a brief second, Daniel thought he could spin the narrative, but then his phone vibrated violently in his hand. He frantically pulled out his phone, his thumb shaking so violently he could barely swipe the screen. The screen flashed with the name of his chief loan officer. Daniel picked it up on speaker in his panic. "Daniel, what the hell is going on?" The banker's voice screamed through the receiver, loud enough for the front row to hear. "Aegis Capital just froze all your corporate accounts. The bank is pulling your credit lines effective immediately." The call went dead. Daniel stood paralyzed as Marcus turned to the crowd, his voice booming. "As of precisely 8 p.m. tonight, Aegis Capital has exercised its contract rights. We are seizing 100% of your voting shares, freezing all corporate assets, and repossessing your waterfront mansion. You are officially, completely wiped out." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Daniel stared at his phone, sweating profusely, trying to dial another number, but his private attorney hung up on him after a 5-second conversation. Before he could process the blow, the massive digital screen behind the stage flickered. The promotional graphics vanished, replaced by a clean audio recording. The crisp, unmistakable sound of recorded phone calls began broadcasting through the overhead speakers. It was Daniel's voice. "We just need the medical examiner to sign off on the cognitive decline papers, Jess. Once the court approves the conservatorship, her $2.4 million is entirely ours." Then came Jessica's venomous reply. "Make sure the old woman stays locked up tight in that facility. If she ruins our real estate deal now, I swear I'll make your life a living hell." The audio played on, unspooling every dirty detail of their conspiracy, how they forged medical documents and laughed about dumping me into a memory care unit just to fund their luxury lifestyle. The ballroom erupted into outright chaos. High society guests recoiled in absolute disgust, whispering behind their glasses. Jessica's face turned the color of ash. Her phone buzzed with alert notifications of declining credit cards. The mask of the high society queen completely shattered. She spun around, her eyes blazing with raw fury. "You absolute idiot!" Jessica shrieked at the top of her lungs, grabbing Daniel by his lapels. "You said she was locked away. You ruined everything. My name, my money, my life." She struck Daniel across the face with a vicious slap that rang across the stage. Without a single look back, she gathered her dress, pushed past the stunned guests, and fled the ballroom in absolute disgrace. Left entirely alone under the spotlights, stripped of his company, his mansion, his reputation, and his wife, Daniel completely broke down. All his arrogant bravado evaporated. With a choked sob, his knees buckled and he dropped hard onto the marble floor right at my feet. "Mom, please," Daniel whimpered, his voice cracking as he reached out a trembling hand to grab the hem of my trousers. "I was blind. Please forgive me. Help me, Mom." I looked down at my son kneeling in the dirt of his own making. There was no anger left in me, only a profound, hollow emptiness. I slowly took a step back, pulling my coat out of his reach, and looked down with unblinking silence. The society he sold his soul to watched him in utter contempt, leaving him alone in the burning ashes of his own greed. Standing there in that grand ballroom, watching Daniel collapse into the dust of his own making, I didn't feel a single drop of triumph. There was no sweet revenge, no rush of satisfaction, just a heavy, quiet settling in my chest. I didn't stay to watch the flashbulbs blinding my son, or listen to the vicious whispers of high society turning on him. I simply walked out through the heavy glass doors and into the cool Boston night air, leaving the wreckage behind. Before I could truly move forward, I needed to face the ghosts of my past one last time. A week later, I drove out alone to my old suburban home, the house Daniel had tried so desperately to sell behind my back. Stepping inside, the quiet emptiness hit me. I walked into the living room where I had spent 30 years raising him, remembering the countless sleepless nights spent balancing blueprints on the coffee table. I walked over to the wooden pantry door and traced my fingers over the faded pencil marks measuring Daniel's height from age 5 to 18. My heart didn't break this time. I looked at those marks, acknowledged the little boy I once loved, and gently closed the door. The past was fixed in time, but it no longer controlled me. On my way back to the city, I made one more stop, I pulled my car over across the street from Pinecrest, staring at the high iron gates and the concrete building where they had tried to bury me alive. 6 months ago, looking at those high security walls filled me with terrifying dread. But sitting there behind the wheel, breathing the cool fresh air, a quiet wave of peace washed over me. The cage was still there, but I was free. Closing that painful chapter didn't mean closing my heart. The millions recovered from the corporate restructuring of Daniel's failed firm were never meant to sit in a bank account or feed my own vanity. Money, I realized, is simply an amplifier. It either feeds greed or restores justice. With Marcus's help, the Harlan and Helen Foundation was officially born. Our very first case arrived just 3 weeks later. An 82-year-old widow named Clara was being forced into a locked facility by her own son, who was attempting to seize her family home. I personally walked into that courtroom alongside Marcus with our legal team. When the judge dismissed the fake conservatorship and granted Clara her full freedom, she collapsed into my arms, weeping softly into my shoulder. "I thought nobody would ever believe me," she whispered, her hands trembling against my back. Looking into her tear-filled eyes, I saw my own reflection from those dark months at Pinecrest. That single moment proved to me that our foundation wasn't just an abstract legal entity, it was a real, living shield for the forgotten. We didn't build a monument to my grievance. We built a shield, a nationwide legal defense fund specifically dedicated to protecting vulnerable seniors trapped in abusive conservatorships. Across America, thousands of elderly people locked away behind closed doors, stripped of their voices and property, just like I almost was, finally had someone standing in their corner. Every time our team of lawyers freed another innocent person, I felt another layer of my own pain fade away. Yet, the true healing didn't happen in a courtroom or a foundation office. It happened miles away, on a quiet stretch of coastline where the salty Atlantic air cleared away the final ashes of my past. The heavy morning fog was just beginning to lift off the ocean when I heard the familiar patter of running feet across the wooden porch of my new seaside home. Before I could turn around from the kitchen counter, 2 small arms wrapped tightly around my waist. "Grandma Helen!" Leo's voice bubbled over with that pure, unfiltered joy that only a child carries. Sarah followed right behind him, carrying 2 warm cups of coffee, her face glowing with a peaceful smile that had returned to her after months of hardship. I knelt down on the wooden floor, pulling both of them into an embrace so deep and fierce that every remaining shadow of betrayal dissolved completely into the sea breeze. Holding them close, looking into their honest eyes, the final truth settled deep in my soul. For years, I had agonized over bloodlines, over a son who chose money over a mother's devotion. But sitting on that sunlit porch with Leo and Sarah, I understood something profound. True family is never defined by shared DNA, especially when that DNA is tainted by selfishness and ambition. Real family is found in the people who reach out their hands when your world collapses, the ones who choose to sit with you in the dark until the dawn breaks. My journey had never been about destroying my son. It was about reclaiming my own life, protecting the helpless, and discovering what truly remains when the storm clears. The foundation was standing strong, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. My grandson was laughing beside me, safe and whole, and I, an old engineer who refused to be broken, had finally built a home that no betrayal could ever tear down. Every single morning now, I sit on the wooden porch of my seaside home with a simple black cup of coffee, watching the morning mist rise off the Atlantic tide. Every Saturday, young Leo comes running over with his small metal toolbox, proudly helping me fix the weathered wooden fences around the garden. Together, we plant yellow marigolds along the gravel path, our hands covered in rich soil. Sarah usually stands by the kitchen door holding her mug, watching us with a quiet, peaceful smile that fills my chest with warmth. There are no high society galas here, no million-dollar contracts, and no toxic ambitions. Just the salt air and the sweet sound of my grandson's laughter echoing across the yard. Sitting out here in the quiet early hours, my mind often drifts back to the past. I miss my late husband Harlan, deeply wishing he were here to see Leo grow into such a kind, gentle boy. And yes, if I'm being completely honest, there are moments when I still remember the sweet, mud-covered 5-year-old boy Daniel used to be, long before greed and ambition completely consumed his soul. I will never forgive what Daniel did to me or Sarah, nor will I ever allow him back into our lives. But sitting on this porch, I also realize I refuse to spend my remaining years poisoning my heart with hatred. Moving on was never about holding a grudge. It was about choosing peace over bitterness. Looking at Leo hammering a small nail into the fence rail, I often think about how easily a life can get off track when you measure your worth by the wrong things. Daniel built a grand castle out of glass and polished chrome, but because it was rooted in greed and deceit, it shattered into useless dust the second the wind shifted. He thought he could chain my physical body, erase my legal identity, and trade my life away for status. He forgot that you can never cage a mind that refuses to break. Time has a way of taking away our youth and testing our strength. But sitting here today, I know there are sacred things that time and greed can never touch. A clear mind, an unyielding sense of self-respect, and a heart anchored in genuine love. That resilience is what kept me standing tall when my own flesh and blood tried to bury me alive. It's what allowed me to turn a brutal betrayal into a shield for thousands of elderly people who had no one left to fight for them. If you are listening to my story right now, whether you're sitting in a quiet kitchen or driving home after a long day, I hope my journey leaves you with one simple truth. Never let anyone convince you that your dignity expires with your age, and never surrender the right to write your own story, no matter how much you love someone or how sweetly they promise to take care of you. Protect your independence, hold your loved ones close, and remember that true family isn't built on shared DNA, but on the people who stand by you when everything else falls apart. My name is Helen Harlan. My foundation is standing strong. My grandson is safe, and I have finally built a home that no betrayal can ever tear down. Thank you for listening, and take care of each other. Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.